Good morning and welcome to our fourth annual gridXdays. This is an online two-day conference bringing you cutting-edge discussions on clean technology, sustainable energy, the rise of distributed energy resources, and transformative tech solutions. I'm your host, Georgia Knapp, Senior Content Manager here at gridX. Today and tomorrow, we will welcome over 40 speakers who will educate us on some of the most pressing topics in the energy sphere today. We will have one keynote speaker and 12 different panels that range from the current state of the PV and EV markets to cybersecurity, if the renewable efforts can benefit from partnerships between big and small players, how the energy transition is reshaping society, the pros and cons of retrofitting, and more. This event is streamed live, and we encourage viewers to please interact and ask questions of our panelists. The recordings of this event will be online in a few weeks from now. And to kick us off, I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Camille Paillard, energy analyst for the International Energy Agency, also known as the IEA. At the IEA, she has been the lead author of reports such as Building a Unified National Power Market System in China, Using Digitalization in Emerging Markets and Developing Economies to Enable Demand Response in Buildings, and Institutional Architecture for Regional Power System Integration. In her keynote today, she'll address the urgent need for the timely integration of solar and wind power to achieve both the decarbonization goals and growing electricity demands by 2030. If countries fail to implement integration measures in line with a scenario where they achieve their climate and energy pledges, the global power sector could jeopardize up to 15% of solar PV and wind energy or variable renewable energy generation in 2030. So following all of that, Camille, I will now hand it over to you to speak more.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the kind introduction. So yeah, I'm glad to start these 2 intense days of discussion by presenting some key findings of our report on integrating solar and wind that we released with the IEA in September. So for background, the main objective of this work was to try to identify the strategies that have proven successful to integrate wind and solar PV in real power systems today, and also try to analyze what are the other emerging challenges that are appearing as more and more wind and solar PV get into the grid. And here, what do we mean by integrating solar and wind? It simply means managing more variability in the power system, and for that, we'll need more system variability and flexibility. Let me go here. So here I'd just like to start by giving you a quick overview of the latest wind and solar PV forecast from the IEA up to 2030. So in our main projection at the IEA, we see close to 8 terawatt of solar PV and wind being installed by 2030. And this is mainly driven by supportive policies from government, but also and by a large share by cost reductions in those technologies. So if we put this forecast into the context of tripling renewable capacity by 2030, so which was adopted at COP28 last year, what we see is that current trends and policies put us on track to achieve about 3/4 of this growth needed to achieve this tripling pledge, signaling that an even faster expansion is needed. But so it's not just about expanding capacity, as you know, it's about turning it into actual clean generation. So if countries want to make the most of the benefit brought by renewables in terms of economics, in terms of emission reductions, they need to focus on securely integrating all this capacity coming online and to make sure that clean electricity actually reaches consumers. And as we see, this is already happening in different countries around the world where we have already observed high level of wind and solar penetration with very different kind of conditions and resources. So as you see here on this, countries have predominantly relied on wind power, like Denmark, Ireland, Great Britain, or Morocco, while others have adopted mainly solar for their renewable sources. So it's the case of Chile, California, or Vietnam. It's also worth noting here that, of course, some systems are better prepared to host more renewable capacity. For example, a very well interconnected system such as Denmark will be better equipped to host a lot of capacity compared to an island system like Hawaii, for example. But in the end, regardless of what type of system, what's important is timely integration of this new capacity as the capacity is deployed. And what we start to see now in different jurisdictions is that there are already symptoms of integration of wind and solar lagging behind. So typically, systems today are already facing issues such as grid congestions and more frequent negative electricity prices. So, for example, on the left side of the slide, you can see that costs for managing grid congestions, which includes curtailment, have increased a lot over the past few years. In the US, in Germany, in Great Britain, this has been noticeable. On the right side, you can see as a frequency of negative electricity prices in different jurisdictions, which have deployed a lot of variable renewable energy, like South Australia, Texas, Germany. And so these symptoms, those are just examples, but those symptoms signal red flags to investors that may reduce their willingness to invest in more wind and solar capacity. So this is why timely integration is important, and it's need to happen in synchronization with the deployment of capacity. But here it's hard to know where should we start, what integration measures should we implement first, and what works best at each stage of bringing renewable online. To try to answer these questions that many countries have and that many countries have asked us at the IEA, so we have come up with a phases of VRE integration framework. So VRE stands for Variable Renewable Energy, so wind and solar. So this framework is not new. It has been existing since 2017, but we have updated it this year in the report. And so this framework basically classifies power systems into 6 phases and is meant to show the increasing impact at the system level and corresponding challenges and solution when you integrate more and more wind and solar in the system. So why is it useful? What we see is that it can be used as a guide for policymakers to try to prioritize which integration measures are the most needed for the system, depending at which phase they are. So what you need to do in phase 2 is actually completely different from what you need to prioritize in phase 5. So the characteristics of each phase are described here. I'm going to go through them briefly, but basically phase 1 to 3 are considered low phases, while phase 4 to 6 are higher phases. At phase 1, VRE has no significant impact at the system level beyond some perhaps localized effects, while at phase 2, wind and solar start having a minor to moderate impact on the system. At phase 3, what we see is the impact of wind and solar starts being quite significant as VRE starts determining the operation of the system, creating significant changes in key variables such as the net load. And this is typically where we start seeing the duck curves that is observed in some system. Maybe you're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. At phase 4, VRE meets almost all demand in some periods of the year. And here the key challenge is about the stability of the power system. At phase 5, here the concern is about the significant volumes of excess of production of wind and solar across the year. And finally, in phase 6, which no system in our assessment has reached yet, the system as secure electricity supply from VRE almost exclusively from VRE. So when we look at power system today, and this is the assessment of the different countries that we have looked at, we see that most of the systems today across the world are in low phases. Several countries with different geographies and level of economic development have already reached phase 3, actually, in 2023. So this indicates that there's already a lot of global experience to manage the challenges of the low phases from 1 to 3. And here today, only a few countries only have reached phase 4 and 5, mostly with high penetration of wind power, such as Denmark, Ireland, or Spain. However, what we see is that by 2030, so it's quite soon actually, a broader range of countries will be at higher phases, mainly with high penetration of solar PV like Chile, like Japan and Italy. And generally, by 2030, more systems will be in higher phases of VRE integration than they are today. So that was for the phase framework and the phase assessment. And also another objective of this report, as you mentioned in the introduction, Georgia, was to try to assess the risk of failing to implement sufficient integration measures on time. And we actually carried out at the IEA a first ever quantification of these risks to have the best understanding possible of the integration challenge ahead. So here, let me move on to this slide, which shows that the global growth of solar PV and wind generation between 2022 and 2030 in a scenario where countries meet their climate and energy targets, so the IEA announced pledge scenario. In this scenario, we see that VRE generation will grow by about 9,000 terawatt by 2030, which is roughly equivalent to the global electricity demand of China last year, so which is quite significant. And our analysis found that out of this growth by 2030, about 2/3 needs to be integrated in countries or power systems with low phases condition from phase 1 to phase 3. And the large majority of this growth will happen actually in emerging markets and developing economies such as Brazil, India, Southeast Asia. So many countries with really a great potential for wind and solar that can be unlocked further. So this is actually a good news because it's easier to integrate more wind and solar in systems in low phases condition. But so now let's have a look at the impact of not doing enough for integrating wind and solar PV. So to do this analysis, we have developed a scenario where integration measures by 2030 are not substantially different from what they are today. And we have looked at country by country, what is the expected wind and solar PV growth and how much of this growth could be put at risk if it's not integrated on time. For example, if we fail to develop sufficient grid capacity or enough flexibility resource. And here, as you can see on the graph, what our analysis shows is that failing to implement sufficient integration measures could potentially put at risk indeed 15% of wind and solar generation by 2030. And so reducing the global share of VRE generation. And so a direct consequence of that is that we would see also a 20% smaller reduction in CO2 emission by 2030 if this clean energy at risk of not being integrated is actually compensated by fossil fuel generation. So moving forward, what are these integration measures that government should prioritize depending on the phase of integration they are at? So to answer this question, we did in this report a global stocktake exercise So we took 50 power systems that represent around 90% of the global generation for wind and solar. And our objective during this StockTech exercise was to categorize integration measures and try to find common trends across systems. So which were the widely integration measures, which were ones that are mainly implemented in lower phase system, and what are the measures in higher phase to deal with emerging challenges. So here are some key conclusions from this StockTech exercise. So first, we saw that there are indeed common practices that exist across systems. So this often involve mainly straightforward modification to existing assets or operational arrangements that increase flexibility. So for example, this includes enhancing power plant capability by doing retrofits of coal or gas power plants. In terms of forecasting, it involves incorporating more precise forecasting into system operation. It involves using demand-side measures, enhancing grid capacity and making better use of the interconnection, making system balancing more efficient by improving the dispatching practices, and making also use of storage and developing more capacity. So, of course, we've seen differences in how these countries apply this measure across systems, depending on what resources and levers they have available to them. And here it's kind of what type of output we had in the report, and I invite you to have a look, but you will find in the report a classification of these different measures by phase of VRE integration and how widespread they are in power systems today. So here really the key idea is that VRE integration measures don't need to be implemented all at once or at its highest level of sophistication immediately. Instead, the implementation can be targeted and gradual so that measures address specific challenges brought by wind and solar when they arrive in the system. For example, let's look at demand response. So when a country starts deploying its first VRE plans, there's no need to focus immediately, for example, on developing residential demand programs or having locational pricings to steer the location of new demand. So it makes sense to start with industrial demand response because it allows immediately to mobilize large volumes of flexibility. And this can be done, for example, by policies that are quite straightforward, like time of use tariffs that are generally efficient. And when more flexibility is required later, demand response programs can be expanded to a wider range of consumers. So the conclusion for low systems, for systems in low phases, is that the focus should be first on deploying the VRE capacity and implementing those measures gradually as the need arises. But however, at higher phases, so starting from phase 4, it's not that straightforward, and we need more profound transformation of our power system, and that's what we'll see now. So now we'll focus on systems that are classified in phase 4 or higher. So this is the case of countries like, as I said, Denmark, Ireland, Spain, the UK. So looking at the experience from these countries will be useful for countries that are expected to reach also higher phases by 2030. So like Japan, Italy, or Brazil. And so here what we see is that at those phases, there are two challenges that become more pronounced, in particular related to stability and flexibility. So for stability, it's mainly because it has been traditionally ensured by conventional generators, which provide inertia and support the system voltage during disturbance. But as they are replaced with more and more distributed resources that are connected to the grid through converters, The guarantee that these conventional plants will keep providing this stability decreases. As for flexibility in higher phases, what we see is that daily but also seasonal variability becomes more pronounced, which also creates a need for more flexibility across all timescale. So to address these challenges typical of high phases, we'll need new frameworks and technologies to procure the flexibility and the needed system services from a wider range of resources, because we won't be able to rely solely on conventional generation. So there are well-known solutions such as pumped hydro storage and interconnections, but there are also other assets that will be needed, which are dedicated to solving integration challenges brought by wind and solar. So here on the slide, you have an overview of selected technologies with their levels of maturity. For example, taking synchronous condensers, they have been deployed in Denmark since 2013 to ensure voltage control at high penetration of wind power. So this is quite a mature technology already. Battery storage, of course, you're aware, is becoming more widespread thanks to its decreasing cost. And lately, some batteries have been deployed with grid forming capability to support stability in the United Kingdom, for example. Very interesting project there. We can also mention bidirectional EV charging, or V2G, which is tested in many cities. So here, the key point is that most of the technologies that we need to address those emerging challenges that I mentioned are actually either mature or nearing maturity, which means that for many systems reaching phase 5 or higher, phase 4, phase 5, it depends actually on an effective development of these existing technologies rather than developing completely new ones. While for phase 6, as I mentioned, we don't see any power system in our assessment reaching this phase yet. There are viable technologies that exist, but developing them at a large scale remains limited and would require probably additional testing, such as long duration energy storage, for example. So the key for the successful implementation often lies in appropriate policy and regulatory action. And I will finish with this aspect because our report, as many reports at the IEA, comes with a policy recommendation for policymakers to help them accelerate effective integration of VRE. So here there are 6 points that are more detailed, of course, in the report. But first of all, a key action that we see would be to evaluate a power system current capacity to deal with increasing shares of VRE. So really where we are today and where should we go. Then it's important to establish specific requirements for VRE sources to ensure the security of grid operations. So this includes improving forecasting accuracy and ensuring that these assets are visible and controllable for the system operator. Then unlocking flexibility from the existing power system. Here, strategy can include optimizing dispatch, implementing demand response, and retrofitting existing assets such as coal plants to operate more flexibly. Another area of action is the incentives that encourage a broader range of resources to provide flexibility and system services, such as battery storage, for example, could be a good provider. So this involves clearly defining and measuring the needs of the power system, then developing procurement framework that allows the services to be sourced and effectively from diverse providers. The 5th action has to do with technology for integration that I mentioned earlier. So this plays a critical role, of course, for meeting long-term decarbonization targets. And here we really see that regulatory, market, and strategic support is necessary to drive rapid scale adoption of these technologies. And finally, we recommend really a comprehensive, holistic approach to planning the future power system, which includes adopting a cross-sectoral perspective and integrating new requirements in power system planning, such as resilience, which needs to be also considered in addition to security and efficiency. So I'll stop here, not to run too much over time. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any question on the report that you may have afterwards, either by email, and I'll hand it over back to Georgia now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Camille. That was really interesting. I had read the report, but this actually helped explain or further expand upon some of the questions that I had. We are running a little short on time, but I do have one question that came up while you were talking. So you mentioned a few of the regions that are doing really well with increasing their PV and wind generation. I believe you definitely said Denmark, South Australia. I want to also say Ireland. And you mentioned that policy is a factor, but could it also be attributed to weather, the market conditions, or is it a mixture of all three, the weather, policy, market conditions, in your opinion?
Yeah, thank you. It's indeed interesting to see which are the countries that have done better than others. So yeah, as you said, South Australia, Denmark now are already operating their grids with between 60 and 70% of variable renewable energy. So either wind, either solar. So it's quite impressive to see that, yes, this is actually possible and this is already happening. So so great renewable resources is a driver, but it's not the primary one. I would say it's mainly policy and market conditions that are driving this growth. So when you look at the system, you can see that actually many of them are very ambitious climate laws and targets. For example, in South Australia, they have this objective of reaching 100% renewable energy by 2027. In Germany, it's 80% by 2030. So this is driving visibility for investors because those ambitions are supported by consistent policy over the long term and often also a supportive planning system. And also what I wanted to mention is for the market conditions, that also a very important driver. So in this country, when you look at Germany, but also other jurisdictions, what we see is they also often have at the beginning generous feed-in tariff schemes that drove early adoption of this renewable energy. So now I think every second home in South Australia has rooftop solar panels. But later on, after this feed-in tariff policy were phased out, what drove the adoption was a cost reduction in these technologies, but also other market conditions such as carbon pricing, which made other sources, fossil fuel-based sources, more expensive. And now, in the system, renewables are being more cost competitive. And also, I think it's in South Australia, there was no subsidy to keep the old coal power plants online, which also was a factor that accelerated the uptake of solar PV. So yeah, it's a mixture of all these policy market conditions. So that's quite interesting.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for being our keynote for the 4th annual gridXdays. And we will now get ready for our first session of the conference.